The prayers came in broken whispers, fragments of words that Daniel McCallister had learned at his mother's knee before the world taught him that faith was a luxury men like him could not afford. He knelt beside the shallow grave he had spent 3 days digging with hands that shook from fever and exhaustion, his lips moving in desperate supplication to a God he wasn't sure was listening anymore. The grave was meant for himself. The infection in his leg had spread beyond any remedy he knew, and the nearest doctor was 200 miles through hostile territory. He would never survive in his condition. The Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly around his small ranch, a testament to the isolation he had chosen after too many years of watching good men die for causes that made sense only to politicians and generals. Here, in this valley that existed on no official map, Daniel had built a life measured by the rhythm of seasons rather than the demands of civilization. His cattle grazed freely across grassland that had never known a surveyor's chain, and his cabin sat like a prayer itself against the backdrop of mountains that touched the sky with fingers of stone and snow. But now, the sanctuary that had sheltered him for 7 years was about to become his tomb. The infection had started as a simple cut from barbed wire, the kind of injury that every rancher endured without thought. But this wound had festered despite his careful tending, spreading its poison through flesh that grew more fevered and swollen with each passing day. His leg had turned colors that belonged in nightmares rather than nature, and the smell that rose from the putrid flesh told him everything he needed to know about his chances of seeing another sunrise. The grave he had prepared was honest work, dug deep enough to discourage scavengers and positioned to catch the morning sun that he had always loved best. If he was going to die alone, at least he could choose the manner of his ending, could meet death with the same stubborn dignity that had carried him through war and loss and the long years of solitude that followed. But as darkness gathered around his failing strength, Daniel found himself speaking words he hadn't used since childhood. Prayers that tasted of his mother's kitchen and Sunday mornings when the world had seemed full of possibility rather than pain. "Lord," he whispered through lips cracked by fever, "I don't reckon I got much right to ask for anything, considering how far I've strayed from the path you set out. But if you're up there listening, if you got any mercy left for a man who's made more mistakes than he can count, maybe you could see fit to let this end quick. Don't need saving, just need peace." The words felt strange in his mouth, foreign after years of silence on matters of spirit and faith. But something about approaching death stripped away the armor of cynicism he had worn for so long, leaving him as vulnerable as the boy who had once believed that prayers were heard and answered, that goodness existed in the world, and that love was stronger than the forces that tried to destroy it. He had loved once, deeply and completely, a woman named Sarah who had seen past his scars to the man he might have been if war hadn't carved the softness out of him. She had followed him to this remote valley, had helped him build the cabin and the life they planned to share. But the influenza that swept through the territory 3 years ago had taken her as surely as bullets had taken his comrades, leaving him alone with memories and regrets that weighed more than any pack he had ever carried. The fever was making him lightheaded now, causing the stars to blur and dance above him like celestial moths drawn to some cosmic flame. Daniel tried to rise from his knees beside the grave, intending to return to the cabin where he could die in something approaching comfort. But his strength gave out entirely. He collapsed beside the mound of fresh earth, his body finally surrendering to the poison that had been claiming him by degrees. As consciousness faded, Daniel thought he heard something that couldn't possibly be real. The sound of horses moving in the darkness, the soft murmur of voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize. But hallucinations were common with high fever, he knew, and the mind often created what it most needed to hear in the moments before death claimed its due. He closed his eyes and waited for whatever came next, his lips still moving in prayers that had become as automatic as breathing. The sound that woke him was definitely real, too complex and sustained to be the product of a fevered imagination. Singing, low and melodic, rising and falling, in harmonies that seemed to wrap around him like warm blankets. Daniel forced his eyes open and found himself looking up at a sky that was just beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn. The singing continued, growing stronger and more distinct, accompanied now by the sounds of many people moving with quiet purpose around his property. Daniel managed to turn his head, though the effort sent waves of pain through his infected leg, and saw something that made him wonder if he had already died and entered some fever dream of his own making. The valley around his cabin was filled with people. Native Americans on horseback and on foot, men and women and children spread across his land like a gathering storm that had somehow materialized from earth and sky. At their center sat an elderly man whose bearing spoke of authority earned through wisdom rather than force. He was perhaps 70 years old, his long hair white as winter clouds, and his face marked by lines that told stories of countless seasons survived and lessons learned. Despite his age, he sat his painted horse with the easy grace of someone who had been born to the saddle, and his dark eyes held a warmth that seemed to pierce straight through to Daniel's fevered soul. The old man dismounted and approached Daniel with slow, respectful steps, speaking in English that was careful but clear. "I am called Broken Arrow, chief of the Northern Cheyenne. We have traveled far to answer the prayers that called to us in the darkness. You are Daniel McCallister, the white brother who lives alone in this sacred valley." Daniel tried to speak, but found his throat too dry and constricted to form words. Broken Arrow seemed to understand his difficulty and gestured to someone behind him. A young woman appeared with a water skin, kneeling beside Daniel to help him drink. The water was cool and clean, tasting of mountain streams and carrying with it a strength that seemed to flow directly into his parched body. "How?" Daniel finally managed to croak, his voice barely recognizable even to himself. "How do you know my name?" Broken Arrow settled cross-legged beside him, his weathered hands gentle as he examined Daniel's infected leg without touching the fevered flesh. The spirits carry many kinds of messages for those who know how to listen. 3 nights ago, our medicine woman had a vision of a white man dying alone in a valley that the Cheyenne have always known to be touched by sacred power. She saw him speaking to the Great Spirit in the old way, asking not for his life, but for peace in his ending. The chief's eyes met Daniel's with an intensity that made the sick man feel as though his very soul was being examined and weighed. "But the spirits told our medicine woman that this man's time for dying had not yet come, that he had work still to do in this world. They told her to gather the people and travel to this place, to bring the healing that only community can provide." As if summoned by their chief's words, more people began to approach Daniel's position beside the grave he had dug for himself. He could see that this was not a war party, but something more like a traveling village, complete with families and elders, pack animals loaded with supplies, and children whose bright eyes spoke of curiosity rather than hostility. The sight of so many people in his isolated valley should have alarmed him, but instead he felt a strange sense of rightness, as if this gathering had been planned by forces beyond his understanding. A woman who appeared to be in her 50s approached, carrying what looked like a medicine bundle, her movements deliberate and ceremonial. Her hair was streaked with grey and braided with feathers and small bones, and her face bore the serene expression of someone who had learned to read the invisible currents that flowed between the physical and spiritual worlds. "This is White Dove," Broken Arrow explained, as the medicine woman knelt on Daniel's other side. "She is the one who received the vision, who guided us to this place. She carries medicines that your white doctors do not know, healing ways that reach deeper than flesh and bone." White Dove began to unpack her bundle, revealing an array of herbs and roots, carved bones and small stones that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. She spoke in Cheyenne to Broken Arrow, her voice carrying an authority that made it clear she was accustomed to being obeyed in matters of healing. She says the poison in your leg is serious, but not beyond the reach of proper medicine, Broken Arrow translated. But she also says that the sickness in your body is only part of what ails you. There is poison in your spirit as well, loneliness and grief that has been eating at you longer than any infection. To heal the flesh, we must first heal the heart. Daniel felt tears begin to stream down his fevered cheeks, though whether from gratitude or overwhelm or simple physical weakness, he couldn't say. I don't understand why you would help me. I'm nobody to you people, just another white man taking up space on land that probably belonged to your ancestors. Broken Arrow was quiet for a moment, watching as White Dove began to prepare poultices and teas from her collection of medicines. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of memory and the wisdom that came from understanding the complex currents of history. 7 years ago, when the soldiers came to drive our people from the land where our fathers hunted, we had to leave quickly, taking only what we could carry. My youngest grandson, Little Bear, he was just 5 winters old then, and in the confusion of leaving, he became lost. We searched for him but could not delay our flight. The soldiers were close behind, and many lives depended on our reaching safety. The chief's eyes grew distant as he recalled pain that time had softened but not erased. We thought the boy was dead, killed by soldiers or wild animals, or simply lost to the vastness of the prairie. We mourned him, as we mourned so many others who were taken from us during those dark days. But 3 moons later, a white rancher brought Little Bear to the agency where we had been placed. This rancher, he had found the boy wandering alone, had cared for him and fed him, had learned enough Cheyenne words to understand the child's story. Daniel felt a stirring of memory, something that seemed important though he couldn't immediately place why. The story Broken Arrow was telling felt familiar, as if he had lived it rather than simply heard it. This rancher, Broken Arrow continued, he could have kept the boy, raised him as white child, taken him to authorities who would have placed him with white family. Instead, he spent weeks searching for Little Bear's people, asking questions and following trails until he found us. He wanted nothing in return, expected no reward, simply believed that children belonged with their families. The memory hit Daniel like a physical blow, sudden and complete. A small boy with dark eyes and a solemn expression, found wandering near his property line in clothes too big for his tiny frame. The child had been frightened but not hostile, had accepted food and shelter, while Daniel tried to piece together where he might have come from. It had taken nearly a month of careful inquiry to locate the Cheyenne band that had been relocated to the agency, another week to arrange the reunion that had brought tears to every eye present. "Little Bear," Daniel whispered, remembering the joy in the boy's face when he saw his family again, the gratitude in his grandfather's voice as they were reunited. "I remember him. Small boy, brave as a mountain lion but scared of being alone." Broken Arrow smiled, the first time his expression had shown anything other than serious concern. "Little Bear is now called Strong Runner, and he is one of our finest young warriors. He has never forgotten the white rancher who brought him home to his people. When our medicine woman told us where her vision would lead us, Strong Runner said he had always known that someday we would have chance to repay the kindness that saved his life." As if summoned by their conversation, a young man approached from the direction of the horses. Daniel recognized him immediately, despite the years that had passed. The same dark eyes, now mature and confident, the same serious expression that had marked him as a child. Strong Runner had grown into his name, tall and lean, with the bearing of someone who had earned respect through deed rather than birthright. "White brother," Strong Runner said, kneeling beside Daniel with obvious emotion, "the spirits have brought us full circle. You saved my life when I was lost and alone. Now we are here to save yours when you are lost and alone. This is how the sacred balance is maintained." What followed was unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced. White Dove began the process of treating his infected leg with a combination of herbal medicines and ceremonial practices that seemed to work on multiple levels simultaneously. She cleaned the wound with solutions that stung like fire, but drew out poisons that white medicine had failed to reach. She applied poultices made from plants Daniel couldn't identify, wrapping his leg in soft leather that had been blessed with prayers and sacred smoke. But the physical healing was only part of what took place in that dawn-lit valley. As White Dove worked on his body, other members of the band began to minister to his spirit in ways he hadn't expected. They shared food that carried flavors of the wider world, told stories that placed his individual suffering in the context of universal human experience, sang songs that seemed to reach into the empty places inside him and fill them with something warmer than grief. Children who reminded him of Little Bear at that age approached with shy curiosity, offering small gifts, smooth stones, interesting feathers, flowers picked from the prairie grass around his cabin. Their presence transformed his sterile sanctuary into something that felt like a home, filling spaces that had known only silence with laughter and the endless questions that marked young minds hungry for knowledge about the world. The men of the band, warriors and hunters whose skills had been honed by generations of survival in harsh country, examined his ranch operation with professional interest. They offered suggestions for improving his water system, shared techniques for managing cattle in difficult weather, demonstrated ways of reading animal behavior that Daniel had never considered. Their knowledge, passed down through countless generations of living close to the land, proved far more sophisticated than the methods he had learned from white ranchers. But it was the conversations with the elders that proved most healing to Daniel's wounded spirit. These men and women had lived through losses that made his own grief seem almost manageable. Entire ways of life destroyed, children taken to distant schools, sacred places desecrated by people who saw only resources where the Cheyenne saw relatives. Yet they had maintained their humanity, their capacity for joy and generosity and hope. "Loss is not the end of the story," Broken Arrow told him as they sat together watching the sun climb higher into the morning sky. "It is the middle chapter, the place where we learn what we are truly made of. Your woman, Sarah, her love did not die with her body. It lives on in the kindness you showed my grandson, in the prayers you spoke in darkness, in the man you choose to become, in the time that remains to you." As the day progressed, Daniel felt strength returning to his body in ways that seemed to defy medical explanation. The fever broke, leaving him weak but clear-headed for the first time in weeks. The infection in his leg, while still serious, no longer carried the smell of death that had marked it as fatal. White Dove's medicines were working, but more than that, the presence of community seemed to be calling him back from the edge of the grave he had dug for himself. "Why?" he asked Broken Arrow, as evening approached and cook fires began to bloom across his valley like earthbound stars. "Why bring so many people? Why risk traveling so far for someone you barely knew?" The old chief considered the question while watching children play games that their ancestors had played for countless generations. "Because no one should die alone who has shown kindness to others. Because the sacred balance requires that good deeds be answered with good deeds. Because you saved one of our children, and that makes you family, whether you understand it or not." He gestured toward the bustling camp that had transformed Daniel's isolated valley into a temporary village. "But also because our medicine woman's vision showed her more than just one man dying alone. She saw a future where this valley becomes a meeting place, where people of different tribes learn to understand each other instead of fighting. She saw you as the bridge that could make such understanding possible." Strongrunner approached, carrying a bowl of stew that smelled better than anything Daniel had eaten in months. "The spirits told White Dove that your prayers were heard, but not answered in the way you expected. You asked for peace in dying. Instead, you are given peace in living, chance to use the wisdom earned through suffering to help others find their way through darkness." Udin. As night settled over the valley, Daniel found himself surrounded by voices raised in songs that seemed to weave together the separate threads of individual experience into something larger and more meaningful. The grave he had dug for himself remained open beside his cabin, but it no longer felt like a destination. Instead, it had become a reminder of how close he had come to wasting the gift of continued existence, how nearly he had thrown away the chance to be useful to something greater than his own pain. The healing process took weeks, during which the Cheyenne band remained encamped in Daniel's valley. As his strength returned, he found himself drawn into the daily life of a community in ways that reminded him what it meant to be human rather than simply to exist. He learned skills that no white school had ever taught, gained understanding of the natural world that transformed his relationship to the land he thought he had known. More importantly, he learned that his valley held significance he had never suspected. It was a traditional meeting place, a neutral ground where different tribes had gathered for trade and diplomacy since time immemorial. The springs that watered his cattle were considered sacred, and the cave system in the nearby bluffs held rock art that told stories stretching back to the beginning of human presence in this land. "The spirits guided you to this place for a reason," White Dove told him through Broken Arrow's translation as his recovery neared completion. "Not just to hide from the world, but to prepare for the work that was always meant to be yours. This valley calls for a keeper, someone who can help different peoples remember how to speak to each other instead of fighting." When the Cheyenne band finally prepared to continue their journey to winter grounds, they left behind more than just the memory of their healing presence. They established Daniel as a recognized peacekeeper, someone whose word would be trusted by various tribes when conflicts arose. His ranch became a neutral territory where disputes could be settled through negotiation rather than violence, where cultural exchange could take place without the suspicion that marked most interactions between native peoples and white settlers. The years that followed brought a parade of visitors to Daniel's Valley, not just Native Americans seeking his counsel or services, but white settlers who had heard of a place where fair dealing was the rule rather than the exception. His trading post became renowned for honest weights and measures, for prices that didn't vary based on the buyer's race or desperation, for the kind of hospitality that created friends rather than merely customers. But the greatest change was in Daniel himself. The prayers that had once come in desperate whispers now flowed easily throughout his daily routine, not as pleas for divine intervention, but as conversations with a presence he had learned to trust. The isolation that had been his refuge became a chosen solitude, peaceful rather than bitter, productive rather than self-destructive. When visitors asked him about the source of his contentment, Daniel would point to the filled-in grave beside his cabin, now marked by wildflowers that bloomed in defiance of the dark purpose for which the ground had been disturbed. "I prayed for peace in dying," he would tell them, and learned that sometimes God answers prayers by teaching us how to live. The Cheyenne returned to his valley every few years, renewing friendships and checking on the man they had claimed as family. Strong Runner brought his own children to meet the white grandfather who had saved their father's life, continuing a cycle of connection that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. And always, when they gathered around evening fires to share stories and songs, they would tell the tale of how prayers whispered in darkness had been answered by the arrival of 200 warriors who chose healing over violence, community over isolation, and love over the fear that too often divided their worlds.